Hello, everyone, and welcome. I hope you're all enjoying day 3 so far. It is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Next up, we have Brian Drake, and he's the Director of Artificial Intelligence at Defense Intelligence Agency. And his talk today is entitled, Positioning Defense Intelligence for an AI-Enabled Future. So please welcome Brian to our virtual stage. Brian, you can turn on your camera and come out and join us. Hello.
Hey, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here today and a real honor to represent my agency to such a great group of folks. Already been connected with folks in the deal room and hopefully have a couple of good meetings this week and next. So I'm really excited about that. And so today I'm going to talk about some work we've been doing over the past 6 months or so, developing an agency-wide artificial intelligence. We're going to share a couple of slides with you so you get to see that. This will be the first time that we've actually shared this in full to the public. So I'm really interested in what your questions will be, and please drop those into the chat and I'll be sure to address those as we press forward. So here's what we're going to talk about today. I've already kind of given you a bit of what the strategic framework does, but we're going to go into some more depth. We're going to talk about how we view the threat environment into the future, talk about some of our findings, and of course, we're going to answer some. So the artificial intelligence strategic framework is really a dive into all of the pieces that impact the defense intelligence world. In our business, we're a knowledge organization. We are trying to understand something about everything all the time. And as data is growing, we have an understanding less of what it is that's really pressing for our policymakers, because as data grows, it also gets faster. So as part of that, we came to the conclusion that we needed to better understand how that future was coming at us and how we were going to align other strategies that have been issued by the Department of Defense to specifically the defense intelligence mission, and then how we're going to deliver insights in that regard. So the first step we took was aligning all those different strategies. And you can see just through things in the national security strategy, the national defense strategy, there's all sorts of things that talk about how artificial intelligence will impact our future environment. But there wasn't anything specific about how defense intelligence will play into that realm. So as we started to align that strategy, we started to gather original and derivative data from lots of different sources. We ended up interviewing about 60 different folks inside and outside of our agency to talk about what they saw as the future environment and some changes they thought we needed to make. From that, we started to identify a variety of threats, which we'll talk about very soon. Then we started to figure out what types of threats and opportunities do we need to think about into that future, and then what changes can we make now, in a year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years out. And with that, we provide some recommendations for the command element. So with that, I want to talk about how we're defining artificial intelligence. So lots of different ways people talk about this environment. There's a lot of mixing between what is machine learning, what is deep learning, supervised, unsupervised work. We tend to gravitate toward what our oversight bodies tell us. In this case, we were using the definition that was done through a major issue study through the Director of National Intelligence, which and really what we find compelling about this particular definition is that we don't view artificial intelligence as a way to replace any of our workforce. In fact, what we think is that artificial intelligence will be an augmentation of what they are doing today and how they can help how AI can help those folks do their job. Kind of reflected in that is the word cloud you see to your right. Those all came from a survey that we did internal to the agency and with the combatant commands. And in that survey, we asked folks, how do you define artificial intelligence? We got a lot of interesting answers. We received over 1,000 responses in that survey, which is pretty good for us. And through that, we were able to find out other things of interest to us, things like what were particular pain points for them trying to work on artificial intelligence products they already had in tow, what were some other challenges they had with what they wanted to do into the future, how do policies interact there, what kind of training did they need to see. And with that data, we were able to fashion some reasonable ways ahead. So I want to spend some time talking about how the threat environment. So when we start thinking about growth in the data sphere, we took a look through a lot of different places. We particularly like this graph that you see at the top left. This depiction shows that by 2025, it's estimated that there'll be 175 zettabytes of data available in the global data sphere. A zettabyte, for those who don't know, is about 35,000 years of high definition video. That's a lot of information to go through. And how are we going to confront that kind of data environment when we need to know something about everything all the time? And if we need to know those things, how will data interact in that space amongst itself? Data begets data. So how will we interpret that data? And how will we then derive value from it? And we are already seeing some of those changes come to us now. So I've shown here a depiction of 4 categories. We want to talk about customers first. We have customers in the Department of Defense that are starting to look at artificial intelligence in very new and different ways. So most people are probably aware of the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center, which is our nexus point in the Department of Defense to work on artificial intelligence projects. We get a lot of guidance from them. They also help us understand what's occurring corporately. One of the organizations that is really pressing ahead in this space is the Strategic Capabilities Office. This office runs small discrete projects and tests concepts that can be used in a warfighting domain. The picture you see right there is actually a drone that got dropped from a pod. And in that deployment, they ran that drone in concert with a flight of F-18s. And this was a little bit of a dicey proposition, right? Because these drones are actually not much larger than the palm of my hand. And those drones could easily get sucked into any of these jet engines and destroy the plane, of course, destroy itself. So they had to have a mesh network deployed for those drones so that they were not running into jet wash. They could run missions coincidentally. So the question that we ask ourselves is, if that is where our customers are, and they're going to have data that they need to have delivered to those platforms, how is that data going to come? How do we feed data to that? How does data come back? And how do we understand what data they are collecting? So that's the first area. The second thing that we look at is in the commercial space. We've talked about the commercial data sphere, but I've placed here a Waymo car, which used to be the Google car program. This is interesting to us because this means that the commercial sector is starting to look at how it interprets the physical world. How is that information being transmitted across what networks and what kind of volume? If we're starting to talk about fully autonomous systems, it consumes a lot of information, and it's dynamic, it's chaotic data. So there might be intelligence value in some of those commercial applications, and we might want to know something about them. So what does that mean for us? How do we confront that environment? The third thing I want to talk about is the opponent space. So what you see there is a display from the Russian Federation, it's from the Kalashnikov group. It's an array of what they claim are autonomous weapon systems. And, the Russians make a lot of different claims, so I can't speak to whether or not it's accurate. But what I can say is that these weapons were for sale. And if these weapons are for sale and there's at least some autonomy behind these weapons, what does that mean for other platforms that they may or may not be developing? They're at least thinking about this space in a very different way than we are thinking about it. And if we know anything about the Russian way of warfare, their ethical and moral frameworks for how they apply force on a battlefield environment are very different than ours. And we want to be sure that we stay on the right side of moral warfighting and not fall into the traps that we think the Russians are probably going to fall into. The last thing that we want to think about is people. I kind of foreshadowed this when we talk about the definition of artificial intelligence, but people here will drive the future of this space. We believe that we have to make an investment in our people first and primarily before we start making major investments in automation. That means that we need to think about the types of people we're hiring, how we're training them, how we're reskilling, and how we best mate their skills with what automation brings to bear. It can be very powerful, it can be very destructive. So we have to be very deliberate about how we apply. The last item I'll highlight here is this graph that we have here at the bottom left. This is a reflection of part of our procurement process. At the bottom, the green bars represent the Defense Department budget. The blue bars represent number of protests we have against contract actions, and the blue line represents effectiveness rate against those protests. Effectiveness in this context means if a vendor had a problem with how a contract was awarded and they went to the general accounting office and they asked for some sort of satisfaction, 45% of the time, they would get some sort of satisfaction, which could mean the contract gets recompeted. It means that they could get the award. It means any number of things. So 45% of the time, we know that our contract actions are protested, and the higher dollar value of those contract actions, the more likely they are to be protested. And in this particular space, we know artificial intelligence solutions are rather costly. So we expect that we're going to have to think about procurement in a different way as we move forward. Because the longer that we have things caught up in protest, which can delay actions for 6 months to a year, we will have less capability to deliver to our customers, and we cannot sustain those kind of delays. So with that, we developed a broad series of recommendations. There are actually 20 total, but I'm not going to talk about all of them today. We put them into 4 broad categories for partnerships, talent, architecture, and data. And in those categories, we have sub-pieces that then we further discuss at length. And I'm going to talk about 2 in depth. The first kind of item I want to highlight is where we think DIA adds a strategic value for the defense intelligence enterprise. So one of the things that we pride ourselves on is being able to work with our what we call the Five Eyes partners. These are the other English-speaking nations of the world. This is Canada, the United Kingdom, New Zealand, and it includes Australia. So in that mix of countries, we've had a very strong relationship since World War II, and we've been able to go to war together and affect great national security objectives together. But we believe that into the future, we will see the value of partnerships and alliances rise in artificial intelligence. And we think that we expect to see our adversaries get more isolated into that future. So we think that our value in this space uniquely as an agency is to link together with Five Eyes partners, NATO partners, and what we call third parties, those not in those 2 alliances, where we can find joint opportunities to work together. And in those opportunities, we can deliver the right kind of strategic effects for the better protection of world peace. The second item that's kind of related to that is that ethical question that I foreshadowed before. When we think about the warfighting tactics of places like Russia, where there's a lot of indiscriminate warfare, where there's targeting of hospitals, where they employ means of destruction that harm innocent civilians, those are ethical principles that we will never support as a nation. Those are things that we do not do in our way of fighting war. So what we are principally concerned about in this context is making sure that the American way of fighting war is upheld in a moral standard and aligns to what we would say is an ethical practice. So what we're trying to do as the defense intelligence support component of all those activities is ensure that our policies for what we're extracting and how that informs duty of care missions, in other words, missions where human life may or may not be at stake, where we apply those principles diligently and ensure that when we deploy any AI solution, that it in fact renders the results that we expect and adheres to our way of projecting force when necessary and protecting the peace. It also means that we have to think about things that are more traditional ethical issues that we've already encountered in the AI space, things like gender bias, racial bias, other social inequity bias. We have to be very diligent of those things because as we think about our work products, our most important ethical principle is objectivity. We present to decision makers in the White House, Congress, and to the Pentagon, of course, advice and intelligence that is completely objective. And why we do that is because we want to be truth for those decision makers. And sometimes that truth is very ugly, like a policy is not working. Sometimes that truth is very positive, that a policy is working. But our strength as a defense intelligence component is bringing that objectivity to the table and assuring our clients that we can tell them we know this to be true because, which means we need things like explainable AI. We can't buy black boxes because we won't know how they work. And we've already written into some of our intelligence community standards the specifics of what we need those things to do. And as part of our procurement processes, we are now writing in language that say things like that if you are not willing to share your intellectual property with us so that we can make informed decisions on those pieces, we can't do business with you. And that's just how it has to be. The next thing I want to talk about is our architecture piece. We work primarily in classified domains on isolated networks. And we've been doing that for a very, very long time. So in the future data environment, we expect growth to occur mostly in unclassified environments, not in classified environments. So what we expect to see, and what we think we need to be building toward, is an environment where we can better accommodate those needs and start to anticipate what's going to happen with large data sets and how we better process those. And that doesn't mean that we won't be interested in what other sources can tell us about interesting things, but we will have to be more careful about what we decide to move up into a classified environment, because it does cost us a lot of money to do that sort of thing. So how do we think about what insights we derive on the unclassified environment? How do we protect the sources and methods in that space? And then how do we move that all forward, which is on that third bullet off there of reform architecture. When we start talking about CI for AI, this is a different way of thinking about counterintelligence in an artificial intelligence construct. So we're interested in things like where is this company located? Is it owned by US citizens? Are there folks that we know have clearances that can work with us? These are all questions that we would ask of companies. Now, we're not necessarily saying everybody has to get cleared, but what we are saying is that these are things that we have to consider in order to make sure that we're protecting everything appropriately. Last thing I want to talk about on this slide is this gold copy, and I actually have a slide to illustrate this, but I want to further discuss that in detail. So we actually got this concept from one of our interviewees about how to think about data. We want to treat data like rain, drops toward mission needs that have either a human, an application, or a machine-to-machine purpose. So we think of the data and how that's collected as what we call a sensor layer. And sensors can be lots of different things. They can be people, they can be machines, they can be all sorts of things. So in that sensor layer and how that data comes to us presently, we just take it all and then we mash it up and throw it somewhere. We actually don't spend a lot of time figuring out how to curate that data and how to tag it and bring it into the applications that need it tagged in a particular way in order for it to be used. So one thing that is really interesting about this is that we are encountering this challenge not from ourselves alone, but also from our vendor pools. Our vendors will provide us data that they've already pre-labeled, which is sometimes very helpful, but sometimes the labels aren't very good, or sometimes the labels don't match the ontology we already have. And then we have to spend time going back and fixing that ontology. So when we're talking about a really, really large data set, with like millions and millions and millions of entries, well, that's a pretty significant lift. And without additional automation on top of that, in order to fix those labels, that becomes really burdensome. So what we want to be able to do is actually take in data at a gold copy level. So when we bring it in from the sensor layer, we have the copy as it was brought in, and we do not change it. Instead, we want to use a data enrichment layer to start to provide insight into that data and label it according to our ontology, which means the creation of standards, which means the creation of how do we put the right security classifications on that data, how do we share it with the people that have the correct need to know. Those are all the things we want to do at data enrichment. And then from that, we want to take it down to the application layer. How are we preparing that data at the data enrichment level in order to prepare it for future uses? This is where we think about things like the future of warfare and combat. If the Strategic Capabilities Office is already creating these drones that are the size of my hand, that's an application. That's in the application layer. What do we need to prepare for that office in order to enable their mission? How do we do that? How do we provide that to them at what security fabric? So they may not want all that information or the data it needs, the intelligence it needs to do its mission in a classified way. They might want that in an unclassified way. Okay, something we can do, but we have to architect for that, and we have to think about how we will provide that data and in what periodicity. So the last thing I want to talk about is this is a graphic depiction of what we are talking about. JWICS is the Joint Worldwide Intelligence Communication System. SIPRNet is our secret level network, and the NIPR is our unclassified network. JWICS is where we primarily do our business, and it has been the past behavior of the agencies in the defense intelligence enterprise is to take information that was at the unclassified level and move it all the way up into the JWICS level, into the top secret networks. We think that that's probably not a sustainable way ahead for lots of reasons. If the COVID outbreak has taught us anything, is that once we start moving things up into a classified domain, with that, it requires lots of new security protocols. Like I have to be in a secure facility, which means I have to be around more people. If I be more around people, I have to take precautions, especially during the pandemic. So how do I enable more folks to do more work at a lower level of classification, perhaps from home, and what kind of work will they be doing? If the artificial intelligence strategy has a say in that, we would say that we have to have more data scientists working with data in a more meaningful way, and we need to be doing more of that work from home. And that is both a policy question as well as an infrastructure question. We have to pivot toward a way to accommodate that. Now, one takeaway folks have with this graphic is that we're walking away from classified networks. That is not at all the case. We will always have a need to protect secrets. The difference will be that into the future, the quantum of where that information will be available will probably be in the unclassified domain, not in the classified domain. So we want to position for that future. So I know I've said a lot and talked for a little while, so I'm going to stop sharing. And I'm going to take any questions here. And of course, I'm going to show my age a little bit and put my glasses on here. Okay. How do we define data tradecraft? Thanks, Chris, for the question. So it's very interesting. So we have we practice tradecraft as an agency in a different definition. When we talk about tradecraft in our culture, we're talking about how we know things and why we know those things. So, for example, if I were to conduct an interview with someone and I wanted to understand what are their motivations, why are they telling me these things, when did I talk to them, how frequently do they talk to me, there is a way to ask those questions to get the answers that you desire. In the same way, how do I communicate back to you that I am telling you something that's objective and true? So just like how we're saying we're trying to uphold our ethical principles of objectivity and being that definitive source for truth for our customers, tradecraft to us, analytic tradecraft in that regard, is trying to communicate, how do I know what I'm saying is truthful and how do I support that assertion? So when we start talking about large data sets, how do I know that when that data was collected, that I can trust that data was collected honestly within legal boundaries, protecting U.S. persons information, privacy issues? That is the type of data tradecraft that we are interested in. It's the matter of extraction, how it is held, how it is tagged, and then how it's going to be ultimately used. That is where data tradecraft is moving for us. We are still in the midst of writing those policies. We're still trying to figure out what that will look like, but those are the things that we're bouncing around. So we have a minute to go. If somebody has, can type real quickly, I can answer another question. I don't think we're going to get another one. So really do appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. If you would like to reach out to me in the deal room, please go ahead, and I can answer some questions offline if you're interested. Yeah, NIPRNet means open sources. That's correct. OSINT, open source intelligence. And please follow up with me anytime you need. Thanks.